we're going to head to a theist, I think, because the word Jewish doesn't necessarily mean theistic for sure. But we're going to talk to Marie, who is Jewish, so doesn't believe specifically in Jesus, but says based on Jewish texts that there is a possibility that some similar man existed. Marie, can you hear us, first of all, is the first question.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I am a theist and a Jewish, so
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. And I think the reason why I wanted to give you the intro first, based on reading it, is because I kind of want to get to a point that's going to be, now that you verified you are a theistic Jew, that I want to get to what might be contentious between us, because when you say Jewish text, I assume you're meaning lots of things in the Old Testament. Maybe there are things that are outside of that, but you're meaning so you're not meaning the Torah. You're not meaning the anything in the Old Testament.
Not the Old Testament. Nothing in the Tanakh. I'm specifically referring to something called the Talmud, which isn't really it's basically a bunch of rabbis debating about a lot of stuff.
Right. And so you believe there's evidence in the Talmud that a figure of Jesus existed, that not the Messiah, but a Jesus guy.
I don't think that there's full proof that some guy, they similar name to Jesus, existed, and a lot of that probably has to do with there isn't a lot of texts on pretty much that community in general from similar eras of the Roman Empire, if he did exist. So I'm not here to offer solid proof because there isn't. I'm just saying that there's a possibility that someone similar to Jesus could have existed based off a few texts. And you already talked about Josephus and Tacitus. And then in the Talmud, there's a couple times, it's pretty small, they refer to this dude named Yeshua. And the Talmud was written a couple hundred years after Jesus. So again, not strongest evidence. But Yeshua was a dude who was a sectarian. He broke off from Judaism. Some people, he basically broke off from mainstream Judaism and created a subsection, kind of like Jesus did. And his name is Yeshua, which is likely what Jesus' name would have been in Hebrew. So, along with Josephus, there probably was some guy that broke off and had his own sect in a similar time period is basically it.
Marie, I guess what I want to say as far as the agnostic here, the reason why I don't find that more compelling is, as you mentioned, we're talking about the couple hundred years later. Even by the time of Josephus, and I'm just going to call him Tinnitus. I know it's Tacitus, but Tinnitus is always what comes to mind first. You're talking about people who are writing when Christianity, to some degree, has already existed. There's already an establishment of.
Oh, yeah.
So as a matter of saying that Jesus existed or not, prior to the establishment of Christianity or during the establishment of Christianity, then you've got kind of a ball game. But if we're going to keep talking about at a certain point, how far is too far? At a certain point, is a pope in, the 12th century talking about Jesus now evidence that the literal man Jesus existed? That's why. So just as a whether or not it's a historical figure, because historical figures don't necessarily factually exist. That's not how history is done. Isn't something I guess I'm trying to evaluate. I'm trying to evaluate whether or not, as a fact of reality, Jesus the man existed. And I can't say that the Talmud, with its account being even further along than Josephus and Tinnitus, I can't say that is more or less compelling. In fact, I'd say it's less compelling than just the existence of the Bible itself, as far as evidence for, which I don't find extremely compelling. Then there's
I completely agree. The thing I was also going to talk about Josephus. You guys already talked about him and Tacitus. It's more of just there is some talks about some kind of historical figure, but again, there isn't a lot of evidence. So there isn't proof, but there's there is a possibility that is written down on a couple accounts that some guy might have existed that did these things. I can't find any evidence that this guy was crucified, but that's really
I get it.
No real proof.
Some guy might have existed, I think even is John's position, except for that he might have existed, but on current evidence, there's no, if better evidence came out that he existed, John would cease to be a mythicist, I suppose.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So
I think that, sorry, you go.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just gonna say, if I could say something about the Talmud, the dating of it isn't too much of a problem, really, when you think about historical sources. But the issue that you run into usually with later dates is whether or not they have sources that date earlier than that. So, like, take for instance Alexander the Great. The best biography that we have of Alexander the Great wasn't written until 500 years after he lived, and that was written by Arian. But you see, the big thing is with Arian is that he was using firsthand accounts about Alexander the Great in the form of two of his generals, right? So he used firsthand accounts to write his biography about him. So it really depends on what sources did these later writers use. Now, as far as the Talmud goes, the Jesus mentioned in the Talmud does not mention at all, or does not match up at all with what we know about the Jesus of Christianity. Even a more conservative historical look at it. Well, so the time that the Talmud places this Jesus as breaking off from the Jews and going his own way, it was actually over 100 years before the 30s AD. It actually happened under King Jannaeus in between 80 BC and like 70 BC, I think is what it amounted to. And in the account in the Talmud, it actually has him being killed, stoned, and then crucified. And then all of his disciples that were following him, they were also killed as well. So this particular Jesus in the Talmud really doesn't match what we would expect for a Jesus of Christianity. But I will say that the Talmud is, it has a very good historical model, or not historical model, but a good messianic model for their messiahs, because it actually has two different messiahs in it that come in order to absolve the sins, a Yeshua ben Joseph and a Yeshua ben David. Yeshua ben Joseph is the one that's supposed to die to absolve sins, and then Yeshua ben David, it comes back in and resurrects Yeshua ben Joseph as part of their messianic expectations. And so with that, the difference between the Talmud messianic expectations and the Christian messianic expectations is basically the Christians just merged these two figures that we see in the Talmud into one figure of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Oh, I actually didn't know that, but that's super interesting. Thank you.
I would definitely look.
I mean, I think we're pretty much all generally on the same page, though.
Yeah.
In that there's not a lot of evidence.
So I am curious, though, with your current religious beliefs, do you believe in the historical Moses, or the historical Noah, or the historical Adam and Eve as like being literal historical figures, or in your version of Judaism, are they more stories?
I mean, maybe existed, maybe not in the way exactly it was said by religion. I mean, but that stuff, there is no evidence for that stuff. That's just pure faith. Like, that's, I'm not going to come here and try and prove that those things are real.
Depending on the claim. And so the question, the reason why I want to ask you if you do believe, I wanted to know upon what basis you do, because things like Moses, because we were talking about Jewish texts and the reliability when it comes to historical stuff, and the older the text, the less reliable it seems to be. So like Moses, not only is there not evidence for Moses and the Exodus, the evidence we do have is that it almost certainly didn't happen. The types of Jews that were meant to exist as slaves in Egypt didn't even actually exist in that century. Not to mention everything, every other sort of account you would have from these record-keeping people just didn't exist. Plus, the more we learn about how the pyramids and the great structures there were built, all of those things also contradictory to the biblical account or the accounts that come out of the Jewish texts. When it comes to someone like Adam and Eve, I mean, there's a scientific claim there that these are the first humans, and we absolutely know that that doesn't exist. So that's why I wanted to ask about where do these other things that not only do they fail historical review, in this case, they fail scientific review and make themselves essentially impossible to have occurred, similar with Noah and the worldwide flood, which didn't happen. I'm curious where you fall on those things.
I mean, at least for me, like, if science trumps it, science trumps it. Like, I do believe in a general religiosity. And I mean, I haven't finished reading through the Tanakh, which is like the Old Testament, so the Jewish Bible. So I can't really say, oh yeah, I definitely have this belief on it, because I'm still melding my own beliefs in those areas. I specifically brought up the Talmud because I know that that's a text that's not really a "this came from God" thing. It's basically just a bunch of rabbis writing down their thoughts. So that is
hanging out.
It's a much more accurate thing that you can actually talk about.
It was their version of a Zoom call back in the day, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Something interesting to bring up is that the conversation that's happening around the historical Jesus now is the exact same conversation that happened around the historicity of Moses and Abraham more than 100 years ago. And it took a little while, but the current scholarly consensus is that Moses, Abraham, Noah, all of the Old Testament like patriarchs, they didn't actually exist. There's nothing to suggest that they actually walked the earth. This is due to how the Pentateuch was written. There's no way to actually establish that they were historical people. So the current scholarly consensus on these is that they didn't exist. And so historical Jesus studies is kind of going through the exact same thing right now.
So I guess the question I have for you, Marie, is if you were to do the
prophet that we, Oh no, you go. Sorry.
The question I have for you, Marie, and there's a delay, which is what causes all of us to talk over each other at first and stuff. So it's not your fault or anything. The question I have for you is, knowing if you're able to research and validate the things that we're suggesting, because obviously we don't want you to take our word for it. We want you to go and do the research yourself independently and find out. Does that affect your faith at all? Does it make you reassess your religious beliefs there, especially in the context of, yes, we have science now and we can do these kinds of tests, but in the past, participation in these religions were much more dependent on accepting these things as literal history. And so I'm curious if you do go out and you do that research with whatever your theistic belief is it something that will test that belief? Will it test your faith? Or is it going to be something that you go, okay, well, at the end of the day, I'm still deciding I believe at the core of this religion, so I'm just going to dismiss that which invalidates it and embrace that which validates it?
I mean, I've never looked at the Tanakh as being like 100% accurate, because I think people write those things down, but I don't think it would have a huge effect on me, because, like, yeah, my faith might be wrong, but I don't really care as long as I'm not hurting anyone. Like, I don't really care if it's that wrong, because it does a lot for me, and as long as no one's getting hurt out of it, and there isn't a belief system that creates harm towards others, which then it does more positive in my life, and then it's not a big deal.
Is that a good basis upon which to believe something, though, whether it's Is it better to believe things that are true and can be adequately demonstrated, or is it better to believe things because it would be nice if it was true? And then the second question, I'm going to give you two, is it possible that a belief that isn't true, that you believe on the basis of faith, if faith is a bad way to get to truth, is perpetuating the cycle and saying that faith is an okay way to believe even if it can't get you to truth, is that a potential form of harm? And therefore the belief wouldn't be harmless? Sorry, those are two very long questions. So let's go with the second one, because the first one's less important.
Just the second one.
The belief
okay.
isn't, if the belief is not true, and you're believing it based on faith, and faith is not a good way to get to truth, is perpetuating the idea that believing something on faith is an okay way to believe in and of itself harmful?
I think it's kind of depends. I don't think it's really a big deal to believe something that maybe may or may not be true. And I do believe that there are a lot of faiths that can be very harmful, which is why I think it needs to be brought into a secular lens in order to assess if it's actually being harmful to people. For example, stuff about LGBT people in a lot of faiths is incredibly harmful and causes a lot of people to be honest, die. But in terms of what you're doing with yourself, I don't really think it's harmful until you start pushing it on others.
See, for me,
but if
I
you
think
just yeah.
I was going to say, for me, I think it's wrong to say it's okay to believe based on faith unless it's harmful, because whether or not something is good or bad, harmful or non-harmful, doesn't actually speak to whether or not the thing is itself true. And I think whether something is true is the important part. So the problem I have is if you're saying it's okay to believe based on faith, even if it's wrong, people with harmful beliefs still are validated by the I get to believe this based on faith. And so now when you say, okay, you get to believe things based on faith, but not if they're harmful, you have to demonstrate why being harmful invalidates the faith, which is a task I don't think you can do. There are lots of things that are true that are harmful. Yeah. And so saying that you can't hold that belief because it's harmful wouldn't be one. There are certainly, for example, we don't let people get away with being a serial killer if they have a pre-existing condition that made them more or less likely to go down that path. We don't excuse murder based on psychopathy. So even though there is a reason why it happened, we don't excuse those things. So there are lots of things that are harmful beliefs that are true that you still have to actually take the fact that they are true. So basically, the point that I'm trying to get at is...
There's a higher burden of proof there. You can't just believe it. You have to actually show that is accurate.
I think all faith has the same level of burden of proof, because faith is in and of itself an excuse to not meet a burden of proof. It's to say, I don't have proof, but I'm going to believe anyway based on faith. Obviously, I'm going to find those ones that are harmful more offensive, but I'm going to find them for very secular reasons outside of the validity of the faith itself. I can't agree with you here that it doesn't matter, which is what you said, if you believe in something that isn't true. I think that whether something is true or not is the thing that matters the absolute most. And so you will have religions, like I come from Mormonism, and one of the things you said was that it does so much good for me. Well, that's what Mormons say. And that's what I said to other people, because when you're in those faith-based systems, when they are wrong, you actually can't conceptualize the harm they are doing. Until I was outside of the Mormon church, I didn't realize that they are a super duper abusive organization. And in fact, other religions don't see them that way. It's until you get outside of thinking in that method. Now, that's not to say not all religions. I know plenty of religious people who can identify the problems with Mormonism, though sometimes when they start to list off those problems, they start to list off things that their religion does too, just with a different coat of paint. So this is why I think it's so important because I don't think you actually have the tools to assess whether or not your belief is harmful until you've established whether or not your belief is true.
Okay, that's fair. I'm probably going to go and think about that a bit more.
Yeah.
Just because it takes a while for ideas to sink in. I need to.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't want you to just.
Yeah.
I would have been disappointed if you were like, you know what, Jimmy, I'm an atheist now. You need more time thinking and research before where you started to get there.
I just want to. I don't really think I have more to say, but I want to thank both of you. Yeah. You are great, Jimmy. I love your show. It always gets me to think more critically about things, and I think it's really important to try and bring the critical lens in. So
I'm glad you do. I'm glad you feel that way. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye, Marie.